Violent conflict is not inevitable. And in fact, there are things that every single one of us can do to reduce the tensions that fuel violence in our communities. Now, I grew up crisscrossing cultures and communities that sometimes had negative views about one another. My parents were immigrants who did everything they could to settle our family in a town in Connecticut where my brother and I would have the best education possible. And yet every summer we would go back to Turkey with my mother's family, where we would stay in a house where we needed to keep the wood-burning stove in the bathroom stoked with kindling if we wanted the water to be warm in our bath, and where the toys I would play with my cousins and other kids in the neighborhood included the rubber tire off the broken toy truck and a stick, and see if we could roll it down the street. Then I'd go back to New Canaan at the end of the summer, and if I wanted hot water, I just turned the tap, and the toys I played with always included the latest video games. It just gave me an insight at a very young age at how similar people can be in terms of their aspirations and their hopes, their motivations, even when their circumstances and the opportunities afforded to them can be so different. I went on from there. I started doing my first jobs were working with an environmental advocacy firm, going door to door and raising money. And it was a young crowd. It was the summer. I made a lot of friends. But a lot of those friends, being activists, they had some pretty strong views. They thought that corporations and the people that led them, some of them felt this way anyway, were pretty evil. And yet the parents of some of my closest friends where I was growing up were the CEOs and executives of major companies. And I knew them to be really wonderful, generous, good people at the base. And it just made it very difficult for me, going back and forth across these divisions, to really buy into any blanket statements that Muslims are all this way, or Jews are that way, or conservatives are this way, or liberals are that way, or Trump supporters are this way, and Clinton supporters are that way. You know, not because I necessarily was any better than anyone. I just had been afforded this opportunity to establish friendships and relationships across a lot of those labels, and I knew that even when people were accurately described by some of those labels, there wasn't a single person who was fully encapsulated by just one of those labels. But I also had gotten this insight at that age into the other side of the equation, to what it takes to cause stereotypes and even animosity, and I developed even some sympathy for people who developed that animosity for others. Not because I agreed with them, but I saw how, you know, animosity, aggression, even bigotry, how these things, although often stated with great strength and confidence, they rarely ever came from a place of strength and confidence. It was just the opposite. They almost always came from a place of fear and insecurity. When I was working with that environmental group, I really had a breakthrough, and it really changed the kind of jobs that I would do after that. I started to work always at the intersection of differences, and it's what I ended up dedicating my entire career to and where I'm working now. I had the extraordinary opportunity when I was in college. I got trained in mediation. I started a Muslim-Jewish dialogue group on campus about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was an utter disaster, and the only thing I really remember about it is that people left angrier than when they came in. But it was my first try. I later got to work with some of my real heroes. I got to work with Kofi Annan. I got to work with Archbishop Tutu on a UN initiative that the Secretary General had launched to build bridges across cultures. And I spent most of my career working with the organization I now represent and now the president of, Search for Common Ground, a global peace-building organization where I get to work with colleagues, some of the bravest people in the world, working at the intersection of some of the most deadly and violent conflicts that you can imagine. And from all this, I've really come to believe in really two convictions. One is that violence simply is not inevitable, though so many of us believe that it is. If you look at the research from the credible research institutes in Oslo or Stockholm or elsewhere, or you follow the work of Steven Pinker, you see that, you know, the incidence of violence and the percentage of the global population dying from violent conflict, for instance, in the last 20 years, is a fraction of what it was in almost any 20-year period in modern history. And you see that, although sometimes unsteady, the trends of violence have been steadily going down for generations now. But even if you don't really buy into the data, or you're not going to go look up Scandinavian research papers, I'd like to encourage you to just think about one thing, one fact, that every single war, ends. In the last century, there were probably no two people who hated one another more than the French and the Germans. They fought 2 world wars. They went through the German occupation of France, the horror of the Holocaust. And today, French and German citizens don't need passports to cross each other's borders. They share the same currency. And war between France and Germany today is about as unthinkable as peace between them was 75 years ago. And it's not an anomaly. In my lifetime alone, we've seen the end of apartheid, the end of the Catholic-Protestant wars in Ireland, the end of wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia, the end of the Cold War. We just saw the signing of a peace treaty ending a 52-year war in Colombia. And it's not to say that these things are all permanent and irreversible. Some of them are tenuous. And it's also not to ignore the horror of what continues to happen in places like Yemen and Syria. In fact, I have colleagues and friends who are directly in the middle of those violent conflicts, standing in that very difficult and very narrow middle ground, trying to bring people together. But what it does tell us is that even the most cynical view of history will show you that all wars do end. There's nothing inevitable about wars. And if there's nothing inevitable about any particular war, I don't know why we give into the belief that war itself is inevitable. And that brings me to the second conviction, which is that regular citizens like you and I can make a very big difference in whether our world becomes more just and peaceful or more unjust and warlike. I've seen this to dramatic effect in many of the places where we work. I remember several years ago being in Sierra Leone, going to a training, a community training that our team was organizing there, and there was a young man standing in the back, and he wasn't saying anything, and he didn't say anything the whole day. And so when it was all over, I asked my colleague, who was that guy? He just stood there the whole time. And they said, oh, he's been showing up at our events regularly, but he hasn't said anything, he hasn't opened up yet, but we welcome him. Well, eventually he did open up. His name was Stephen Swanky. He had been abducted at the age of 11, forced to serve as a child soldier. He had been demobilized through a UN demobilization process at the age of 14, and he was now lost. You know, he didn't have his education. His community was scared of him. He didn't have a rank or a cause anymore or an affiliation, and he was looking for meaning. Our team got to know Stephen, and he was extraordinary once he started opening up. And eventually worked with him not only to do some interviews on the radio, but by the age of 15 to host his own radio show in a way that only Stephen could, because he was speaking to the very insecurities and fears of the child soldiers that were still in the bush, who were scared about what was going to happen if they came out. This young man at the age of 15 hosted this popular show in a way that directly resulted and supported the demobilization of thousands of child soldiers and had a direct impact on the end of that war. And this is a kid with, no education, no resources, no reason to have any hope that he could make any kind of difference. And so that sort of brings me back to us. Everything that we do, every single thing that we do, the way that we engage in our political debates and our social media, the way that we talk about the campaigns playing out before us, the way we engage with difference, it's either bringing our world closer together or helping to pull it apart. There really isn't much middle ground on this anymore. And it's critically important and it's increasingly urgent that we choose the bringing together side of things, because there are three things going on in the world today that are undeniable. First, the world is more and more diverse. Second, the world is more and more connected at an accelerating pace. And third, the world is more and more armed. And increasing diversity, increasing connectivity with those differences, and more weapons is not the ingredients of a more just and peaceful world. Increasing diversity and increasing connectivity are great starting points, but we have to begin investing in that fourth piece. And that fourth piece is really the infrastructure and the culture and the demonstration of how we're going to reach across our differences to deal more effectively with our problems and treat them as shared problems rather than you against me. Now, there are three ways that anybody can do this, from my 8-year-old daughter to our political leaders and everybody in this room. And they're really easy. The first two of them you can do from your couch. The third one's a bit of a bear. But the first one is, think about who loses if you win. Who loses if you, whatever your cause is, whoever your political candidate is, how are the people who disagree with you going to come out of that debate on social media, or how are they going to feel after the election? Are they going to feel at least that their views were heard, listened to, respected, or are they going to feel that they've been marginalized, ignored, left out? Second, make the decision that you actually care what happens to them. I think if we can try to elevate our care for our adversaries close, if not to the same level as the causes that we're advancing against them, then we stand a chance. And the fact is, we don't really have much of a choice anyway, because we're all in this together whether we like it or not, and that's increasingly clear the world over. And third, take that care and do the most difficult piece, which is get up, reach out, and start a conversation across those differences. Now, this is going to seem trite and really basic, but this is genuinely from me getting to watch my hero, Archbishop Tutu, to Stephen Swanky, the 15-year-old in Sierra Leone. This is some of the basic stuff that is really the beginning of transformation, because it transforms two things. On the one hand, it changes yourself, because if you can engage in those conversations with as open ears and as open a heart as you can muster, you're going to find, sometimes despite yourself, that you really like somebody, or you have something in common with them, or you can relate to them on some level in a way that makes it a lot harder just to write them off. And second, it's going to transform them. We work with an MIT neuroscience team that has been looking at the impact of dialogues that we facilitate. We call them virtual exchanges between young Americans and Europeans and their peers across the Muslim world. And the neuroscientists and we are really interested in what are the things that lead people to open up and engage constructively in dialogue across difference, and what are the things that lead people to shut down or get really aggressive. And the key threshold that the neuroscientists have found and that our facilitators affirm from their practical experience of these dialogues is that being agreed with by someone else is irrelevant. It has no impact. The critical threshold to somebody becoming a more constructive engager with difference is having the experience of being heard and respected, especially when they express something with which the other side doesn't agree. We run these dialogues and people say things like, I think the 9/11 attacks were organized by your government. Or other people will say, I don't think extremism in the Muslim world is a fringe thing, I think your religion is violent. And these things get said, and people who say them sometimes say them just to be hurtful, sometimes say them because they truly believe them, but either way, they're expecting to be shut down. And when instead they're met with questions, why do you feel that way? What have you been through? I totally disagree with you, but I want to understand where you're coming from. It has an incredible, incredible lightening effect. And we see that young people then suddenly become much more open to self-critical thought, to being open to the other perspective, to asking questions themselves. So if we can do these three things, if we can think about who loses if we win, if we can actually make the decision that we care what happens to them, and if we can start a conversation with them with open ears and open hearts, those will be the first major steps to us building a much more just and peaceful world in which we can all thrive. Thank you.